Thanks for coming. I'm really chuffed to see so many people here. What I'm going to try... Yeah, should we just, if we just got the lights out on this bit, or you can just settle down for a little snooze now. But at least I won't know if you're snoozing, so no embarrassment at all. So, as Maddie said, our exhibition, Shakespeare's Dead, had a title which was intended, of course, to be a pun, partly that Shakespeare himself was dead, and partly about the dead in Shakespeare, Shakespeare's dead characters. What the exhibition does, I think, is a lot about the second of those things, and not actually so much about the first, although we do have both of the Bodleian's copies of the First Folio on display in the exhibition. I think that's the first time they've been on display together for quite some time, probably since 1916, since that exhibition. So do go and look at them if you haven't seen them already. So what I wanted to talk about today was the first part of the pun, the idea of Shakespeare himself being dead. And I want to focus on a very short period of time between Shakespeare's death in 1616 and the publication of the First Folio in 1623. And I want to try and think about that period as a crucial time for the establishment of Shakespeare's reputation and the building of the premise, the basis on which we're celebrating Shakespeare 400 years ago. So I suppose underneath my what I'm going to say today is my sense that if this period between 1616 and 1623 had not been as it was, we would not now be here thinking about Shakespeare 400 years later. We'll see if I've convinced you of that by the end, by the 28 minutes I've now got to do that. Okay, so I wanted to start here because it's a really salutary reminder. There was a famous poet and dramatist who died in the spring of 1616 and was immediately buried in what would become Poets' Corner, what was starting to be known as Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. But that poet and dramatist was not Shakespeare. It was Francis Beaumont. Here we see him. So Beaumont in 1616, he dies about 6 weeks before Shakespeare. He is he's recognised as a writer, as a poet to go alongside Chaucer and Spenser in Westminster Abbey in a way that Shakespeare is not. Shakespeare will wait until well into the 18th century to get a monument in Poets' Corner. And the first part of my talk is actually about the absence of memorialising of Shakespeare immediately in the immediate aftermath of his death in 1616. And this is one slide that I want to start with. If you went to the bookstalls around Paul's Churchyard in 1616, wondering what was new in the field of printed drama, these are some of the things that you might have seen. A new edition, a new expanded edition of Dr. Faustus, Middleton's play, A Trick to Catch the Old One, an edition of Musidorus, one of the great sort of old stagers of the Elizabethan and Jacobean period. So a whole range of new plays. Perhaps most prominently, in fact, this next one, a folio, so a big volume book of the plays of the works of Ben Jonson. So Jonson's plays, but also some of his masques and some of his non-dramatic poetry. Now, what you would not have been able to find in 1616 on those St. Paul's Churchyard bookstores was a new edition of a play by Shakespeare. So I just want to pause on that for a minute. We all know that the artist gets a sort of perverse fillip from dying. We know that from David Bowie, we know it from Prince, we know it from all kinds of modern artists who we might have sort of forgotten about a bit, but we feel very nostalgic about when they die, and we say, weren't they good back in the day, and let's buy their book or their album, or let's get it out and play it again. So we know that patterns of consumption have often neglected the artist who is now dead, partly because they have often got older and fallen out of the limelight a bit. So their reputation may have fallen away a little bit. But at the point when they die, we suddenly are all interested again, even if for a short time. That happens quite compellingly in the Elizabethan period on the death of Christopher Marlowe, when in fact Marlowe's print presence expands hugely at his death in order to capitalise, I think, on a certain kind of notoriety which that death has generated. So Marlowe becomes a print author, really, because of the interest that's aroused by his death. What we see in Shakespeare's case, though, is no evidence in the print market that anybody notices that he's died. So no new play, no new edition in print. There are plenty of Shakespeare plays which have not at this time been printed. So there's plenty of material that could have been put out by printers had they wanted to. But in fact, we don't see that. And that's one indication of a general, rather deafening silence about the death of Shakespeare across literary culture more generally. We might compare this interestingly. We had Marlowe on the one hand. Let's think about Burbage on the other. Richard Burbage, who was Shakespeare's main actor, companion, the first Othello, the first Hamlet, the first Macbeth, the first Richard III. Burbage dies 3 years after Shakespeare in 1619. There is a large outpouring of elegies, poems, and other memorial material about Burbage. Burbage was a celebrity and a kind of superstar. In fact, people at the time noticed that Queen Anne, James's queen, had died quite recently, and nobody seemed anything like as bothered about her death as they did about the death of Burbage. And I've just given you a couple of examples. This first one here about Burbage. He's gone, and with him what a world are dead, which he revived, to be revived so no more. Young Hamlet, old Hieronimo, that's from the kids' play, The Spanish Tragedy. Kind Lear, the grieved Moor, Othello, and more beside, that lived in him, have now forever died. So there's a really strong sense that not only has Burbage died, but so have all these other people too. This is a real duplicated loss because these characters will never come to life again in the same way. There's a pithier elegy on Burbage, which is one of my favourites, which I'll give you now. So Burbage is a celebrity in a way on his death, in a way that Shakespeare doesn't seem to be on his. We could look at the number of elegies and the recognition factor that Burbage's death has in early modern culture and compare it again with the lack of any such response to the death of Shakespeare. Now, let's go here. So, if you're a conspiracy theorist, you would think that the fact that nobody mentions that Shakespeare has died means that probably Shakespeare never existed at all, and that in fact he was just a two-dimensional kind of mask for some other more glamorous and more socially acceptable author of the plays. But I think the truth about the quietness, the lack of impact of Shakespeare's death is something actually a bit more mundane and a bit more banal. I think Shakespeare is not that popular by 1616. And let me talk a little bit about that. I mean, that's sort of counterintuitive to us in certain ways, in that we feel that Shakespeare must have been sort of getting better and better and more popular and better well known. But if we think about adjacent industries that we understand better, we know that that's not really how artistic careers go on, particularly not in industries which have a real investment in new work and in young audiences or in kind of fashionable audiences. So the theatre in this period is an entertainment industry much more akin perhaps to cinema or even to pop music in our own time. That's to say, it's very, very invested in novelty, in newness. New plays and new styles of play are what people want to go to the theatre to see. That's strange to us because a new play is probably quite a small part of the theatrical repertoire we have now. We've got a theatre which is entirely based on, essentially on revivals, on a classic canon of drama which we keep seeing redone over and over again. And it's also based on extremely long runs of popular shows. So if you want to see the Book of Mormon, for example, you could have seen it 3 years ago, and you could probably see it in 5 years' time. That's the kind of idea that we have about how the entertainment industry works. That's not at all the case in the early modern period. Plays move through, they cycle through the repertoire quite quickly. It's very easy for contemporaries of Shakespeare to understand what's an old-fashioned play and what's a modern one. Like us, they had a sense that you could enjoy something that was old-fashioned, partly for the sort of vintage or retro value of it. But they certainly knew that it was old-fashioned. A character in one of Ben Jonson's plays laughs at somebody because their taste is fixed in the taste of 20 years previously, in the years of Titus Andronicus and Spanish tragedy. So this is an industry which moves very, very quickly, and which I think has probably by this point worn Shakespeare out and spat him out. Shakespeare seems to finish writing 1612, 1613. His last plays are collaboratively written with John Fletcher, the man there on the left, a younger man who is going to take over Shakespeare's place as the chief dramatist for the King's Men. When we looked at that pattern of his final years is collaborating with a younger playwright, John Fletcher, we used to think, well, that must have been really good for Fletcher. He would have got all the experience and wisdom of the master. He was the apprentice, sitting at Shakespeare's feet and learning what he could. I think actually the relationship might have been quite the other way around. It was actually quite good for Shakespeare to have new energy, new ideas, a new way of addressing his audiences from Fletcher rather than the other way around. The fact that Shakespeare collaborates at the end of his career, I think, is a sign that he needs some help in addressing what audiences want. And what audiences want is, partly on the one hand, the kind of dark, rather queasy, morally ambiguous tragedies, in particular, that are being written for the indoor theatres. So Shakespeare's late plays probably get played in the Globe and in Blackfriars, the new indoor theatre. But my sense is that Shakespeare never actually really takes to the indoor theatre in the way that a younger playwright like Webster or somebody has their work entirely shaped by that different environment. I think Shakespeare is associated with the Globe in the way he writes plays and in the kinds of plays that that people expect from him. And one of the things that probably doesn't help Shakespeare's reputation is the temporary closure of the Globe after it's burnt down, ironically, when during a performance of one of Shakespeare's own plays or collaborative plays, Henry VIII. So I think that that temporary closure of the Globe may have exacerbated a break with the Shakespearean repertoire and a move to these younger men, these new playwrights. Both of these are playwrights with whom Shakespeare collaborates, but they're both people who are taking over his position as he, in his middle to late 40s, not necessarily particularly old even then, but 20 years into a playwriting career may have seemed time for him to leave it. Most playwriting careers in this period, for one reason or another, are quite short. Lots of people either die early or they actually move on from playwriting. So Shakespeare is not so popular at the point of his death because new playwrights are taking over, and they're taking over in that work for the indoor theatres that I already suggested, but also in this modern, rather arch, clever, Italianate form of tragicomedy, which is particularly associated with Fletcher, who we see there. We've got here one of the things that 19th century document hunters for Shakespeare sort of did for us was to mark up helpfully all the documents they looked at. So this cross here helpfully shows us the date of Shakespeare's burial, the 25th of April, 1616. We don't, of course, know the date of Shakespeare's death, just his burial here. So at that point, Shakespeare is evidently in Stratford. We don't exactly know what his relationship to the London theatre was. We do know that his plays are not being performed as often as they were. We know that Fletcher, particularly the Beaumont and Fletcher brand, even though Beaumont dies in 1616, there's a sort of brand name associated with that writing partnership which carries forward into the 1620s. We know that those plays which are more popular, we know that from court records about what's performed, and we can see some of it from evidence of print publication as well. So here's Shakespeare dying away in Stratford, and this is how Stratford remembers him. The monument to Shakespeare in Holy Trinity Church in Stratford is the cause of enormous controversy, what colour it should be, whether it looks as if it should be Shakespeare or isn't Shakespeare, whether he was always holding a quill or was once holding something else, which I can't now remember. This has been a very, very heavily interpreted monument. One thing that's absolutely true about it is, apart from the pen, apart from the quill, there's no mention here that Shakespeare is a playwright. So what this does not do is to memorialise Shakespeare's professional life in any way. That's not completely uncommon where people's professional life in this period took place in London and they go back to some provincial place where their family life is to be buried, that they're quite likely to be identified in familial terms rather than professional ones on their monument. But this is what Shakespeare gets in Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-upon-Avon. It's not quite Westminster Abbey, is it, really? And it's not quite Poets' Corner. And the lines of Doggerel, which nobody has quite known whether Shakespeare himself wrote, are not quite the elegy perhaps we might want. You can see this represented as in the Shakespeare's Dead exhibition. Shakespeare obviously, I think, knew he was dying in the early weeks of 1616. And he's obviously working reasonably hard on his will with a legal scribe and a lawyer. This is obviously an intermediate draft, not a fair draft of the will, because we can see these inserted lines and crossings out and so on. So it's a work in progress, the will. Most famously, you might know that the second best bed, which is given to Anne Hathaway, is precisely one of these interpolations. But here we're looking at something different. To my fellows, John Hemmings, Richard Burbridge and Henry Condell, 26 shillings 8pence a piece to buy them rings. Okay, and that's, you might be able to see it, it's the little line here. Maybe you can get this word, which is Burbage, with a capital B, there. So it's another afterthought, but one that Shakespeare has put in this version of his will. John Hemmings, Richard Burbage and Henry Condell are the last living survivors of the band of actors who joined together in 1594 to form the Chamberlain's Men. So they've known each other for more than 20 years. They've worked together to build up actually a preeminent theatre company, to become pretty rich in the process. And this idea of the mourning ring, you can see an example of a mourning ring too in the exhibition, has been actually really important for thinking about the First Folio. Because the thing that Hemmings and Condell, who are not particularly well known as actors in Shakespeare's company, it's been hard for us to identify which roles they might have played. They weren't the stars, they weren't quite the spear carriers either, I think, but they were somewhere in between. But the way that they have become famous is as the two men who seem to have supervised in some way the preparation of Shakespeare's plays for collected publication in the First Folio in 1623. For some scholars, this act of collecting the plays together and publishing them has been their ultimate act of memorial for Shakespeare. The act that's cued by Shakespeare offering, leaving the money for these mourning rings. And there's an argument that what they really do is to gather up his literary remains in order that he should be remembered more widely than just privately for them. And let's look at that book now. Master William Shakespeare's comedies, histories and tragedies published according to the true original copies. It's a very familiar book to us now. This iconic first page, the title page, was commissioned from a Flemish engraver called Martin Droeshout. It's the only image of Shakespeare we have which is implicitly attested as a likeness by people who knew him. So it's a really important kind of foundational document in a way for our sense of what Shakespeare was like. And we know that the publishers, the stationers who prepared this book, cared about the image because they send back the plate, the engraving plate, on 2 occasions to be tweaked. The first impression of this has a rather unconvincing sort of neck region. Shakespeare's neck is a bit of a sort of fiction, isn't it, here? It's slightly hidden by the ruff, but there is a slight feeling, more than a slight feeling perhaps, of a sort of head on a plate or something. I always have a slight feeling that the Monty Python team must have done a cartoon of this where the head would just bounce away somehow. And they sent it back to try and get something a bit better, which included some shading, which made it look a little bit less two-dimensional. They sent it back again for some highlights in the eyes. So they cared about how it looked, and they wanted this image. It's relatively unusual to have as the dominant visual image on a title page of a book a picture of the author. Pictures of authors are quite common, but not usually as the dominant one on the title page. There's usually something else there. And also there's an iconography which we've already seen back, if you can remember what Beaumont looked like on the second slide. There's an iconography of authors which this portrait absolutely ignores. The standard portrait in this period has a laurel wreath, makes the poet into a laureate, whether they were a laureate or not. And they're in a round, a sort of oval kind of locket kind of format. So this is quite a different thing, both in its scale and in its style. But I think the image of Shakespeare as a key part to the marketing and the branding, if you like, of this book is really important. I've also given you the catalogue because that too is one of the things that's really important about this book. I already mentioned when I said that there isn't a publishing outpouring in 1616 or even immediately afterwards to capitalise on Shakespeare's death. I already mentioned that half of Shakespeare's plays would be available, in theory, to be published at that point. And that half of the plays, it's a pretty fair guess to say we would not have now if they had not been published at this point. So the last of Shakespeare's plays to be published as an individual play in the so-called quarto form, so a quarto is a small size single play volume, was Othello in 1622. And then there isn't another one until we get the collaborative play Two Noble Kinsmen more than 10 years later. So it's not completely clear. We can't be sure. It's a counterfactual, so we can't be sure. But it's pretty likely that we probably wouldn't have got, say, The Tempest or Macbeth or Julius Caesar or Twelfth Night, all those plays that are folio-only plays. We can have a look at those, if we didn't have this book. So one of the ways that the book memorializes Shakespeare is by doubling his canon, by giving us another 18 plays again. But why would they do this if I'm right in saying that Shakespeare is not actually that popular at this point? I think that's an important question to think about, because I think we have tended to imagine, in retrospect, that an all-new edition of Shakespeare, with half of the plays that we had not previously had a chance to buy, would have been an absolute publisher's sort of no-brainer. Everybody would have wanted to buy it. I'm not sure that that's absolutely true. it takes 9 years for this edition to sell out, 8 years or 9 years. The second edition of the book is in 1632. And most assessments of the investment to return on the book suggest that it would have taken, you needed to sell about 2/3 of the copies before you covered your costs. So that's quite a slow burn in terms of the kind of economics of publishing. And we can read quite a lot of anxiety about the economics of the book in the book itself. So here we've got Hemming and Condell, our actors named in Shakespeare's will. So here they are signing this letter, this epistle to the great variety of readers. So it's an interesting title, The Great Variety of Readers, and it's a title which is quite easy to sentimentalize, as if it's saying, this is a book for everybody. But actually it goes on quite quickly to say, this is a book for everybody who buys it. In brackets, it's also quite an expensive book. The fate of all books depends on your capacities, and not of your heads alone, but of your purses. Read and censure, it says, do so, but buy it first. We don't really mind what you think, but buy it first. It's not quite clear what phenomenon these injunctions are trying to avoid. We don't know, there obviously was a culture of browsing in bookstalls, browsing around St. Paul's and not really having any intention of buying anything. And it may be that it's trying to get over. Whatever you do, buy, so another one. And then at the end, this favourite line, I think, read him therefore and again, and if then you do not like him, surely you are in some manifest danger not to understand him. I think they must teach all teachers that at teaching school. I feel as if I've heard that hundreds of times. You don't not like Shakespeare, you just don't understand Shakespeare. Hemming and Condell have got there first, but they've got there first as part of their sales pitch. So they're keen to sell this book, and that to me is part of a sort of a fair amount of evidence which suggests that what's important about the First Folio is that it actually is quite a speculative publication. It's a brave publication in some ways in the publishing environment of 1623. It works, I think, to try to market a new kind of playbook, a playbook which is quite separated from theatrical life and which has ambitions to take a place in your library, to be studied at your desk, to be given the kind of attention and care that you might give a work acknowledged to be a serious work, like a work of law or a work of history. One of the things that's quite striking about the First Folio is that even though the King's Men, the company for whom these plays were written, even though the King's Men is still performing, is still a preeminent company, they're never mentioned in the book, never mentioned at all. So there isn't a sense that this is a book that's trying to advertise their work. In fact, what's happening to Shakespeare is he's being separated out from the company, identified as a literary figure, and as a solitary, singular literary figure embodied in that title page engraving. I'm just going to give you a little bit of a sense, I hope, in this final example of how the First Folio has preserved Shakespeare's texts in some very open and stimulating ways. So how the actual form of the First Folio might have stimulated us to keep reading, to read them, therefore, again and again. And one of the things I've chosen to think about, just because it's easier for us to look at here, is the way the First Folio deals with stage directions, the way it helps us think about what's happening. I've given you this one just because it's my favourite. Enter Ariel, invisible. I just think that gets better and better the more you think about it. Let's think about this example here. This is from Romeo and Juliet in the folio. We probably all know how Romeo and Juliet begins. It begins with a sonnet delivered by the chorus, two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona where we lay our scene. except actually it doesn't begin with that in the First Folio. It begins with Samson and Gregory, the Capulet servants, beginning this scratchy, tetchy, testosterone-y kind of encounter on the streets of Verona. Now, why does that matter? I think it matters in some quite interesting ways for our reading of this play. The chorus which begins Romeo and Juliet is the most prominent spoiler alert, I suppose, in all of Shakespeare. It tells us what's going to happen. A pair of star-crossed lovers take their life. So it presents for us in miniature a tragedy before we actually see it. It's a really good example of how it's very rarely in Shakespeare important what's going to happen. It's very, very rarely in any doubt what's going to happen. What's important is the how, and probably even more so the why. So the quartos of Romeo and Juliet are set up in quite a confined room for action. We know what's going to happen before the play begins. It's a different play if we don't know that. You would have to be an incurable optimist to think that the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet could turn out well, I admit. But it's not quite so cast about with fatalism, the star-crossed, the kind of inevitability trope, which is so important in that missing prologue. This is an example from the end of King Lear. This will be another spoiler alert if you don't know this play. So at the end of King Lear, Lear enters with Cordelia in his arms. Now, if you look at this in a modern edition, if you've got an edition of this play at home, and you look at this stage direction, you'll see that almost every modern editor will have, with Cordelia dead in his arms or something like that, they will add to the stage direction to make it clear that Cordelia is dead. What happens as the scene goes on, if you remember it, if you've ever seen this, it's a heartbreaking sequence where Lear is trying to convince himself that Cordelia might still be alive. He's looking for signs of life. He calls for a mirror to see if her breath will steam it. What editors tend to give us, modern editors tend to give us, is a position of distance and mastery over that scene. We know that Cordelia is dead. We know this is hopeless. So we can see Lear going through this agony, but we don't really share it. There's something much more, in modern terms, kind of immersive about this stage direction here. It's not clear to us what the status of Cordelia is as we're reading. It probably isn't clear to us in the theatre when Cordelia comes in. One of the things we really enjoyed in the exhibition was working with the idea. This came from a thing probably we all do. If you see a character die on stage and they're lying there while everybody else is talking, don't you always just want to catch them breathing? Which is a funny reflex. We know they're alive, we know they're only pretending, but sort of catching them breathing is something. And obviously the actor here, the Cordelia actor, would still be alive, so one would hope would be breathing, but perhaps would add to more of a sense of uncertainty than we tend to get in a modern edition about what her status is. So something a bit more immersive here. I've got one last example. This is from another folio-only play. This is the end of The Taming of the Shrew. We could have a whole lecture on The Taming of the Shrew. You'll be pleased to know we're not going to do that. But the big question about this play is feisty, difficult, wonderful Catherine tamed by feisty, difficult, violent Petruchio or not? What happens at the end of the play, you might remember, is Petruchio calls, he bets with his male friends that Catherine, previously a kind of untamable wildcat, will put down what she's doing and will come to him when he demands her to. And they say, yeah, right, sure she will. He does that, and she does come. Not only does she come, but she delivers herself with this enormously long speech about the obligations wives owe to husbands. It's an interesting speech, very interesting to think what everybody else is doing on stage, thinking, what are you talking about? I mean, it goes on for probably about 6 minutes. Here is the end of it. place your hands, she's talking to the other women, place your hands below your husband's foot, we've got that here, in token of which duty, if he please, my hand is ready, may it do him ease. And then Petruchio, why, there's a wench, come on and kiss me, Kate. And then Decentio, why, well, go thy ways, old lad, for thou shalt ha't. I feel as if the controversy, the openness to interpretation that this play has continues to cause is partly because of our ongoing fascination with and struggle with ideas of gender relations, but it's partly because the play is so open here. We don't know whether what's Catherine doing when she says, put your hands under your husband's foot, I'm ready to do that right now? Is she saying, I'm ready to do that right now? Or is she saying, I'm ready to do that right now? It's a very, very different play world, depending what she does. Petruchio's, why, there's a wench, come on and kiss me, Kate. Most editors will put there, sometimes they kiss, or sometimes he kisses her. I guess we all know that they're different things. But we don't know whether they do at all. It's not clear to us from the play. They could do either. He could ask her to do that and she could refuse. He could force her to do that. There are all kinds of things. Why does Lucentio come in? Why does he have the next line? It's one of those Shakespeare lines which actually means nothing at all, really. So is he just saying something because there's an embarrassing silence, because nothing's happening? Is he saying something because there's an embarrassing sort of get a room kind of snogging? Is he covering up some? What is he covering up? What's the stage action? We don't know. That's the point. We don't know. I haven't got time to talk about this, but I thought we would just look a little bit at the Bodleian's copy. You can see, just because it's so interesting to see the marks of use on it. These are books that people have actually read, and this is a great copy from the Folio. I became really interested when I was working on the First Folio in the fact that this image is the most famous thing about the book, but almost no copy of the book has it. It was so famous that it begins to circulate individually very early on. Most of the books have copies in or don't have this bit at all. It's one of the sort of paradoxes of the book. And I thought if you're planning a trip to the City of London, this is, I think, the only book that has a monument to it, the First Folio, there just by the Guildhall. I thought I'd just finish by trying to draw together what I've been talking about. So for those benighted regions of the world that don't have their own First Folio, unlike the Bodleian, the Folger Shakespeare Library, which has most of the folios in Washington, D.C., is sending out a sort of Red Cross parcel of First Folios for the 2016 anniversary. And this is their poster for it. First Folio, exclamation mark. We would never do that in the Bodleian, would we? We would never do that. No exclamation mark. Or exclamation point, I suppose it would be. The book that gave us Shakespeare. I think it's a great line. I think what my talk has been trying to do is to modify that just a little bit. I think this is the book that makes Shakespeare. I don't think it gives something which already exists to the world. I think it is the book that creates that something. And let me just recap how I think it does that. It does that because of the number of plays that are in it, because it gives us a size of Shakespeare's canon. If we didn't have those plays, Shakespeare would look like a more Elizabethan playwright than a Jacobean one. He would probably look a more comic playwright than a tragic one. There would be there would be a different tilt to Shakespeare's career, but also it would just look less weighty. It gives us this image of the poet. And if you follow any of the controversies about, is this a new picture of Jane Austen, or is this a new picture of X or Y, you know how important it is, for reasons it's actually quite hard to rationalize, how important it is to feel, A, that we have an image of our writers or our heroes, and that it's an image that looks like we think they ought to have looked. This hasn't been quite the ticket for everybody, but it probably will do. So it gives us the image of Shakespeare, and that's really important to our remembering him and identifying him. And this is a line from Ben Jonson in the book. He was not of an age, but for all time. So Jonson is talking about, in some ways, predicting an afterlife for Shakespeare because of the liveliness of his plays. But he's doing it in the form of a book which probably, more than anything, preserves Shakespeare's plays. And that's for the simple, and I hope you won't think a rather sort of, but rather kind of banal reason. It's a book which is too big to lose. Even the Marquises of Bute, who have been extremely careless with a lot of their property over many centuries, could not lose the First Folio. It was still there. The Jesuit college in Saint-Omer, through the French Revolution and all its upheavals, could not lose the First Folio because it's just a big book. It's a big book that it's hard to lose, and that, I think, the decision to make Shakespeare in that form, in that First Folio form, for whatever reason of kind of memory, affection, or commercial acumen, is, I think, what memorializes Shakespeare for us. Thank you.